If you were trapped on a space station with Mars goo from hell feeding on your friends and threatening human existence on Earth, what would you do? When our astronauts recover alien cells from Mars, they're tasked with finding out whether they're a danger to human life before returning to Earth. They quickly find out that their little pet they nicknamed Calvin isn't a dainty space flower. It's a rapidly evolving, highly intelligent predator that repeatedly foils every plan our astronauts come up with to stop it. I'm going to break down the mistakes made by the wrong stuff, see if we can make better decisions, and ultimately attempt to beat Calvin in life. As an unmanned space probe from Mars hurtles towards Earth carrying Martian soil samples, we meet our astronaut crew. The space probe has been knocked off course and is non-responsive. Rory has been tasked with spacewalking outside the ISS and using a remote arm to catch the probe like a foul ball. Commander Ekaterina, Kat, and Show maneuver the ISS into position, while David, Miranda, and Hugh watch Rory through a viewing window. As the probe slams into the remote arm, Rory successfully captures it. While the crew celebrates, I'll be over here shitting my pants and wondering where Rory's safety tether is. Spacewalking is super dangerous on a good day. Add a giant comet of metal debris hurling towards me while I'm out there, and I might as well let the old gods take me right now. Of course, Rory is likely wearing a safer or simplified aid for EVA rescue, which is a real piece of NASA equipment that acts like a little jetpack that allows him to maneuver using jet thrusters that he controls with a joystick. Would I trust my little jetpack to keep me within arm's reach of the space station when the probe we're about to catch is likely going to knock the space station off course and away from me? Hell no. There also doesn't seem to be any need for Rory to be out here floating in open space to catch this probe. If Miranda, Hugh, and David can watch through the viewing window as Rory catches it with a remote arm, he could probably operate the remote arm from inside the station. Catching debris like this would likely never happen in real life. There's over 27,000 pieces of orbital debris, including things as large as meteorites and as small as individual flecks of paint. Even those flecks of paint can cause serious damage to satellites and spacecrafts because they're traveling between speeds of 15,000 and 17,500 miles per hour, or between 24 and 28,000 kilometers per hour. NASA tracks a 30 mile by 30 mile by 2.5 mile box around the International Space Station for signs of incoming orbital debris. If they received advanced warning that an object larger than 10 centimeters or 4 inches is at risk of hitting the station, NASA and the Russian control centers work together to initiate collision avoidance maneuvers. That's right, for anything larger than a brick. They'll try to move a 1 million pound space station the size of an American football field out of the way. They are definitely not risking the ISS to try and catch something the size of a Midwestern water tank. Wait, I want you to take a second look at your walls right now. Did you do it? What did you see? Let me guess. Absolutely nothing. Your boring ass walls need some hot love from this video's sponsor, Displate. I'm not talking about your mom's prints of 10-year-old you at soccer practice. How uninspiring. No, this is quality metal with fucking exploded star guts 3D printed onto them. Or this chimp astronaut with a shoulder-strapped banana, an iPod, and a cracked helmet, all of which certainly wouldn't survive the vacuum of space. Just needs a Marlboro to complete the cool guy about to die look. These are great conversation pieces to talk about with your hot dates you managed to bring back. I have different types for different rooms. Obviously, I'm not gonna hang Doom Guy over my headboard. Obviously, Mr. Doom and the Predator tag teaming Dwayne Hicks against an alien infestation go into the game room, aka the office. Nuketown goes into the entryway to inform guests what they're walking into. For the living room, tranquil mountains flown over by Bob Ross's beautiful birds where they can hide from Doom Marine's death stare. All these are easily mountable with magnets. No power drilling holes you gotta putty over later. Choose what inspires you, make it matte or gloss, frame it in something sexy, and get it delivered in 4 to 5 business days. Get the nerd discount for the big summer sales by clicking my link in the description. Now go forth and paint thy walls with metal. In the lab, Hugh examines tiny pieces of Martian soil for signs of alien life, while the rest of the crew watches from beyond a lockable glass bulkhead. He finds dormant single-cell organisms covered in flagella. To trigger a response, he asks Show to raise the temperature of the containment unit from -110 degrees Celsius or -166 degrees Fahrenheit to 20 degrees Celsius, or 68 degrees Fahrenheit, in a matter of seconds. The cell remains dormant. Hugh decides to change the atmosphere of the container to better mimic Proterozoic Earth, or Earth as it was 540 million years ago, back when our planet was nothing but a floating rock ball covered in bacteria. To do this, he reduces the oxygen and increases the carbon dioxide. Then he adds glucose, the simple sugar that acts as the most important source of energy for all organisms on Earth. In animal bodies, glucose is found in the form of blood sugar. The single-celled organism twitches. As Dr. Frankenstein would say, you know what they say about gremlins? Don't feed those little bastards after midnight. Unfortunately, in space, it's always midnight. While the experiments Hugh is running are integral to their mission, it definitely feels like NASA should have prepared the station for the arrival of this alien species way before it actually got there. As Commander Cat tells us, the US, China, and Russia are adding rooms to the space station all the time. Knowing that they plan to bring a Martian aboard and experiment on it, you'd think they would have gone the extra mile and, I don't know, created an inescapable containment lab that could be incinerated or easily jettisoned into deep space at the earliest sign of danger. An entire room that could be remote controlled from the outside, so they could adjust the atmospheric levels and feed the alien, and even use tools on it without ever actually having to get near it or touch it with nothing but an easily pierceable latex glove. I know it's probably not latex, but you get my point. This would also allow them to keep their lab tools and surfaces completely sterile to prevent contaminating their experiments or killing Calvin with something as simple as an allergic reaction to the gloves they're using on it. Instead, Hugh reenacts that alien snake scene from Prometheus. To each their own, I guess. After their discovery, the crew is riding high, answering questions posed by kids back on Earth. Rory tells the kids that they're not bringing the alien back. Instead, they'll study it in space where it's safe. Famous last words if I've ever heard them. He just needs to show them a picture of his family to really seal his fate. Miranda, the newest member of the crew, works for the CDC. She's been brought aboard to make sure the crew follows strict quarantine procedures with the alien. Her lack of preparedness is something she'll be regretting a few days from now. Back on Earth, a kid in Times Square reveals that by special lottery, the alien will be named Calvin after her school. Back on the ISS, Miranda examines David, who spent 473 days in space. His muscles are atrophying, and the amount of radiation in his body is reaching critical levels. Still, he doesn't want to go home. We also learn Hugh is actually a paraplegic, paralyzed from the waist down. By day 12, Calvin has grown to the size of a silver dollar and is now made up of trillions of multi-purpose cells. Miranda says that these cells mean Calvin is literally all muscle, all brain, and all eye. As Hugh watches, Calvin grows a tiny arm and then 2 tiny wings. By day 25, Calvin has become prehensile, wrapping around Hugh's finger. An alarm sounds in the lab and the crew comes running. Rory's the first one in. Apparently, Hugh forgot to check the clamp on Calvin's containment box and it failed, changing the air pressure in his cage. Calvin suddenly becomes inactive and stays that way for weeks. The crew is making several big leaps here about Calvin. Calvin is essentially in its embryonic stage, and until they've observed its entire life cycle, there would be no way to conclude its cells are multi-purpose, or have even reached their final form yet. Later, we see the creature does in fact have dedicated cell differentiation, which renders this early hypothesis incorrect. Even if they were right, Calvin is all muscle, all brain, and all eye. All of those things are killable given the right circumstances, and containable given the right container. Calvin suddenly going into hibernation mode is good, nay, a great thing. At this stage in the mission, they've accomplished what they set out to do: discover alien life and prove it's still viable. This is the perfect stage at which to let Calvin hibernate until they can order special equipment to ensure that when he does wake up, they can continue their research safely. Placing Calvin in a bulletproof observation box with a pinprick-sized oxygen tube and a built-in incinerator would likely keep Calvin contained long enough to realize he's too predatory and intelligent to be kept alive with our current resources. Not to mention his rapid growth rate. This is one of the biggest early causes for concern. This thing was a single cell on day 1. They need to chill with the honey drip until they bring up the military-grade incinerators. For all they know, once reawakened, Calvin could grow to the size of the monster in Prometheus, and fuck dealing with that thing. At that point, you might as well eject yourself out of the airlock. Ultimately, Calvin is likely likely just one of trillions of his kind on Mars. Hell, there's probably hundreds if not thousands of others in the soil sample he was found in. He can likely be replaced if they're forced to destroy him, and he'll be easier to incinerate while he's dormant. Instead, Hugh decides to apply electric shocks to Calvin's body. On the third shock, Calvin reawakens and latches onto Hugh, breaking the electric wand. Hugh tries to distract it, but Calvin suddenly crushes his hand. The crew panics. They want to go into the lab to save Hugh, but Miranda refuses to let them enter and breach quarantine protocols. Suddenly, Calvin lets go of Hugh's crushed hand. He uses the sharp end of Hugh's electric wand as a tool to slice through the plastic protective glove and release itself into the lab. Calvin finds the test rat in a nearby container and attacks it, wrapping the rat in its own body like a spider wrapping its prey. Calvin then liquefies and sucks the life out of it in seconds. Rory uses the distraction to open the bulkhead and pull Hugh's unconscious body out. Unfortunately, Calvin latches onto Rory's leg, and David is forced to seal Rory inside the lab. You know what's incredibly stupid? Bringing a sharp object into the quarantine box that can puncture the latex glove and thus break containment. It's obvious these people live in a world where Alien was never released on Blu-ray. We all know what happens when people aboard a spaceship don't listen to the quarantine officer. Protocol is protocol, and enforcing containment firewalls is the sole reason Miranda's on the mission in the first place. Emotionally, it makes sense to save Hugh, but in reality, the moment Calvin proves that he can use tools like the electric wand shiv, they have to leave Hugh in there. If I was designing this containment protocol and it couldn't be done remotely for some reason, I'd have automated quarantine systems that couldn't be reversed until the problem was cleared, or multiple astronauts performed a synchronized test to ensure the crew was not acting on emotional impulses. At the very least, they could have had Hugh wear his spacesuit while handling Calvin, so they could open the airlock in an emergency and flush the room's oxygen and Calvin into space. It would also have been smart to rig this containment box with lockable slides over the glove holes so that they could be sealed in the event the specimen became aggressive. If the box had a drop-down lockable door, sending Rory in to close it would be a no-brainer and likely would have prevented Calvin's escape from the box. But like I said earlier, in an ideal world, NASA would have thought ahead and the entire lab would be remote controlled and ejectable to avoid this entire situation. Maybe this is why Elon Musk wanted to nuke Mars preemptively. Personally, at this point, I'd cross Mars off the New World itinerary. The moon's looking pretty habitable in comparison. Rory goes for an oxygen candle and burns Calvin off of his leg. Miranda tells him he has to get Calvin contained into a Firewall 1 container before he can leave the lab. Rory asks Commander Cat for permission to kill Calvin. Sho tells him to use the portable incinerator to burn Calvin to death. Unfortunately, Calvin seems to swim easily through zero gravity away from the flame. Even when Rory hits Calvin directly, Calvin's barely phased. When Rory runs out of fuel, Calvin crawls into Rory's mouth like the alien from The Faculty and liquefies him from the inside out, drowning Rory in his own blood. When Calvin emerges, he's grown 10 times in size. This is why you don't feed aliens glucose and give them a taste for human blood. As far as the oxygen candle is concerned, Calvin seems to both love and hate it, depending on its growth stage in the movie. Oxygen candles are cylindrical chemical oxygen generators that contain a mix of sodium chlorate and iron powder, which smolder at 600 degrees Celsius or 1,112 degrees Fahrenheit. They can last between 60 and 90 minutes and provide 20 hours of oxygen for 4 people. The way it's used in this scene where Rory breaks the outer glass shell of the wand to scald Calvin is pure science fiction. Human skin starts to quick burn at 54 degrees Celsius or 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Rory's roasting himself as well as Calvin. The portable incinerator, which is like a Nerf gun version of a flamethrower, should be killing Calvin. The problem here is that because Rory's feet aren't on the ground due to zero gravity, he can't brace himself against the floor and aim the flamethrower with any accuracy. Flamethrowers are also chaotic, dispersing energy in many directions. Rory can't target a piece of flubber with the ability to bend and maneuver like an octopus in water, or keep the flame train on it long enough to do any real damage before Calvin shoots away again. Flamethrowers are also dangerous because fire behaves strangely in space, burning equally in all directions at once, for longer on less oxygen. It even becomes invisible under the right circumstances. If you're going to use the flamethrower here, it's best used as an escape mechanism. Once Rory Rory scalded Calvin with the oxygen candle, he should have grabbed the flamethrower and backed up against the glass bulkhead. If Calvin came close, he could use quick bursts from the flamethrower to scare Calvin back, open the door, and back out with the flamethrower still going. Once the bulkhead is sealed with Calvin inside, they could find a way to evacuate the oxygen from the lab and see if that kills Calvin at this stage in his development. Or the crew could back up to the next sealable compartment in the ISS and let Rory try to get out of the lab using the flamethrower to keep Calvin at bay. If he fails and Calvin gets into that compartment, at least he's still contained. Ultimately, the goal is to trap Calvin in a compartment that can be blood of air to see if a vacuum will kill him or trigger hibernation. The small flame on Rory's portable incinerator triggers the anti-fire system, opening valves in the ceiling which siphon oxygen out of the lab. Sho and Kat rush to the control room to seal the valves, but the valves have to be shut down manually one by one. Calvin escapes through the last open valve. Miranda warns that Firewall 2 has failed. Who the hell designed the anti-fire system to require each valve to be manually closed? Even if they weren't anticipating alien goo slithering out, it's still just dumb. Miranda, being the quarantine officer, should have known that the incinerator would have caused open valves to emerge from the ceiling and advised against using it. At this point, Calvin could be anywhere within reach of the lab. The crew needs to pull out the blueprints or diagrams of the space station and begin looking for places where Calvin could be hiding. This will help them narrow down Calvin's territory to a sector of the facility, but also establish potential strategies for killing him before they even attempt to engage with him. The crew has a few options here. They could seal themselves in the Tranquility section of the space station, where the environmental controls are located, and then evacuate oxygen from the rest of the station. They could also lay a trap for Calvin using human blood, since it needs the glucose to continue its growth and development. Using blood, they could lure it into a sealable room, and then jettison it into deep space. They could also use a blood trap to draw it to a far wing of the facility away from the escape lifeboats, and then immediately return to Earth, where they could regroup and plan a new attack with better weapons and more personnel. Or the crew could seal themselves in the station's food storage compartment and starve Calvin to death over a number of weeks, like the zombie from 28 Days Later. Theoretically, Calvin could destroy the ship in the time it takes for him to starve, but so far, he hasn't shown the self-awareness to destroy the environment around him. He only seems to be attacking prey. The other thing to consider here is that Calvin is a carbon-based extremophile, and we have one of those living on Earth already. The tardigrade, or water bear, is a microscopic creature that can survive extreme radiation, frigid temperatures, and even long exposure to the vacuum of space, something we see Calvin can do in a few minutes. But even water bears have weaknesses, and their weaknesses are much simpler than you would expect. Their first weakness is long exposure to UV radiation. In one experiment, tardigrades survived a 12-day journey into the cold vacuum of space on board the PHOTON M3, but only if they were protected by a UV filter. The water bears that didn't have a filter all died out. Ejecting Calvin naked into deep space should kill him, even if it takes a few days or weeks to do it. Their second weakness is heat. Water bears can be killed by heating them to over 83 degrees Celsius or 181 degrees Fahrenheit. This suggests that the incinerator and re-entry will both easily kill him too. Re-entry to Earth's atmosphere generates temperatures around 1650 degrees Celsius or 3000 degrees Fahrenheit, which is why shuttles and escape pods have to be heavily fortified with heat-resistant panels. Even if Calvin is the strongest carbon-based life form in the universe, if he fell through Earth's atmosphere going 17,500 miles per hour, his carbon bonds would be ripped apart at the molecular level. So long as he's not inside an escape pod, he would be obliterated upon re-entry. The crew strategizes a plan of attack. Commander Kat tries to send a message to Earth warning that Calvin has escaped containment and that they're gonna try to kill it. But the comm link to Earth has failed. Sho says the broken transmitter is outside the ship, and Kat says she'll spacewalk to fix it. David helps the commander get into her spacesuit, reassuring her that if she can't fix the comms, they can escape in the station's emergency lifeboats and return to Earth. Miranda corrects him. Nothing goes down to Earth while Calvin is unaccounted for. The commander reaches the transmitter transmitter to discover it overheated because the coolant is gone. Hugh guesses that Calvin consumed it for hydration. David lists off the other sources of coolant aboard the station, including the spacesuits. With its alien sense of dramatic timing, Calvin suddenly leaps out of the comm transmitter and attaches itself to Kat's spacesuit like an octopus. Calvin begins crushing the suit, ultimately breaking her coolant loop and releasing coolant inside her helmet. The commander begins to drown. It'll take too long to reach the airlock, so she untethers herself and leaps through the open space to reach it. David tells Kat she has to help him open the hatch by turning the lever on her side. Instead, she refuses to prevent Calvin from re-entering the ship. Commander Kat drowns in her suit and floats away. Just when it looks like Calvin will float into space with her, he pushes off her body and leaps back aboard the space station. Had the astronauts thoroughly checked the ISS's blueprints before coming out here, they could have hypothesized Calvin's access to this coolant tube and potentially rigged a distraction for Calvin, giving Kat enough time to fix this transmitter. But if I'm being honest, this L is on Kat. Once Kat realized she was fighting a losing battle against the coolant filling her suit, with Calvin giving her a bear hug, instead of trying to open the airlock, she should have hugged back and shoved herself away from the ship towards deep space, or even towards re-entry. Just depends. Do you want a long, cold death or a short, hot death? Deep space is the safer option of the two though. And if you're gonna take one for the team like this, you might as well try to do some backflips. The increased rotational speed and spin of your body will make it hard for Calvin to orchestrate a jump back to the ISS. With Calvin trapped outside, Sho tells the others that the only way Calvin could get back inside is through the nozzles on the thrusters that turn the space station. They use the thruster sensors to fire the thrusters and attempt to shoot Calvin into deep space, but all it does is waste fuel and kick them out of orbit. If they don't restabilize, the space station will go down. Miranda tells them if they have a choice between letting Calvin reach Earth or letting it back into the station, they have to let it back into the station. Calvin finds a thruster nozzle and they let him crawl back in. The remaining crew members make a new plan. They're going to lock off each compartment in the ship, seal themselves off in tranquility with the environmental controls, and vent oxygen from the rest of the ship in an attempt to force Calvin back into hibernation due to loss of atmosphere. The process will take 4 hours. One strategy the astronauts haven't considered yet is rigging a trap outside the space station. They know Calvin is attracted to glucose. They could try taking a bag of blood and releasing it into space using an evacuation tube that's too narrow for Calvin to enter through. If they timed the expulsion of blood exactly right, the creature might leap for the blood, only to realize it can't just fly back to the space station. Sayonara, alien sanguisuge. While waiting, Hugh suddenly goes limp and his heart fails. They defibrillate him and bring him back, but discover Calvin wrapped around his leg in his jumpsuit, drinking his blood. Miranda shocks Calvin with the defibrillator. I don't think he liked that very much. Calvin is now a proper ugly monster, complete with a creepy little shop of horror smile. The crew flees. Miranda and David seal themselves in a compartment with Hugh behind in an airtight bulkhead. Meanwhile, Sho locks himself inside a sleeping pod. Calvin tries to crush the pod open, but can't seem to get in. In the nearby compartment, Hugh succumbs to his injuries. There's a lot of bad panic thinking happening in this scene. Not only should all of these astronauts be carrying weapons at this point, but they should be trying to contextualize what they've already experienced with Calvin to stop him. This is a two-step process. Step 1, contain him. Step 2, kill or get rid of him. Earlier, Calvin struggled with the material of the glove in the lab, and it couldn't get inside Kat's suit while she was outside. It feels like the most rudimentary step to arming yourself would be to either carry around a biohazard plastic bag to trap Calvin long enough to put him into a sealable container, or to wear suits inside the ship to give you at least a few extra moments to fight and prevent it from swimming into your throat like it did with Rory. I mean, that would be my #1 priority, because that is like the worst fucking way to go. Imagine, if you will, these 3 astronauts each carrying a heavy-duty plastic bag. With Calvin latched onto Hugh's leg, one could quickly ensnare Calvin in the bag, followed by the 2 others, giving them 3 layers of protection. They could then shove the whole thing into a sealable container. It might just be confusing and effective enough to let them transport him to the Space Station Integrated Kinetic Launcher for Orbital Payload Systems, SSIKLOPS, the robot mechanism that helps the ISS launch satellites into space. They could then turn the ship so it's facing deep space and launch that sucker into the void. As a last case scenario, this would also allow them to transport him to the escape pod and eject that into space. hell. Pour some blood into a spacesuit, wait for him to swim inside, close the helmet, and eject that out the airlock. Simple enough. The only other thing you gotta worry about is having a sick one-liner right before you eject him. Like, this is where you get off. Then you hit the red button and open the airlock. Let me know what your one-liner would be in the comments. Miranda and David realize that while eating Hugh, Calvin swallowed the tracker on Hugh's leg. This allows them to track its movements in the station. Calvin follows trace amounts of blood to Hugh's body and begins to feed. Suddenly, Miranda and David seal the bulkhead. It turns out they laid a trap for Calvin using Hugh as bait. They begin draining oxygen from the compartment when a proximity alarm goes off. Miranda and David realize a shuttle is approaching the station. They try to warn it away, but it docks with the compartment where they've trapped Calvin. Miranda tells David they're not coming to rescue them. They're coming to trigger Firewall 3. They're going to push the entire station into deep space to prevent Calvin from ever reaching Earth. Firewall 3 sounds needlessly complicated and expensive. The ISS costs $150 billion to build. Compared to our military budget, that's not a lot of money, but the expertise and skill required to build it, it's gonna make some engineers cry. Shoving the whole thing into deep space is like setting fire to the Louvre because a rabid leopard is loose inside. It's more likely they would try to re-establish communication with the people inside before making any rash decisions. As far as the astronauts are concerned, using Hugh's body as bait was a great idea. It's what Hugh would have wanted anyways. Immediately upon seeing the advancing craft, Miranda and David should have used the thrusters to turn the ISS and the room Calvin is trapped in away from the incoming craft. This would have accomplished three things simultaneously. It would have told the incoming craft that there's still humans operating the ISS. It would have prevented them from docking with the section Calvin is in, and it would have made it possible to purge the room in the correct direction, hopefully sending Calvin into deep space. Believing they're being rescued, Sho leaves his broken sleep pod and rushes for the docked shuttle. Miranda and David try to intercept him, but they don't reach him in time. He opens the locked bulkhead in the hatch for the shuttle. Calvin is waiting. It slips inside the shuttle and drains the crew in seconds. Chaos ensues. Calvin breaks the seal between the shuttle and the station, nearly sucking everyone out of the airlock. Miranda and David try to save Sho, but Calvin latches onto him and Sho sacrifices himself, pulling Calvin into the shuttle. Calvin eviscerates him and begins crawling back inside. Miranda fires some sort of oxygen gun at him, giving them just enough time to close the bulkhead on Calvin. The shuttle becomes unstable and crashes into the station, ripping it in half. Is it just me, or does it feel like NASA is feeding astronauts to this alien? Why is this incoming shuttle manned if its sole purpose is to slam into the ISS and knock it into deep space? This pod should have been empty and remote controlled. If you were going to do this, why not equip the docking pod with additional thrusters to push the ISS out of orbit without needing to send an astronaut crew inside the space station that has a blood-sucking alien killing everyone? And what were Miranda and David doing? The moment Calvin was contained, they should have gone to get Sho out of his sleeping pod so they could work as a team to get rid of Calvin and stop the shuttle from hurling them into deep space. Also, get your head in the game, Sho. If you open a shuttle hatch and unleash a deadly blood-drinking alien on two unsuspecting astronauts, you seal that shit up before it can come back inside. Finally, where has Miranda's oxygen gun been hiding this whole time? Why aren't they each carrying one literally everywhere they go in this hobbled space station? David warns Miranda that atmosphere is draining from the station. He also learns they have been thrown out of orbit and the station is plummeting towards Earth. It'll break atmo in 39 minutes. They say they won't survive re-entry, but Calvin could. The temperature drops across the station. David devises one last-ditch Hail Mary way to keep Calvin from reaching Earth. He plans to lure Calvin with oxygen candles to one of the lifeboats and seal himself inside with it. Once inside, he'll jettison himself and Calvin into deep space, while Miranda takes the second lifeboat to Earth. As I said earlier, there is no way Calvin is surviving re-entry. NASA has already calculated what, if any, parts of the ISS would make it to Earth if the ISS fell from orbit. Only heat-resistant parts, like the thrusters, would stand a chance, and Calvin wouldn't be able to survive in one anyways, because even the inside of the thrusters would reach temperatures that would vaporize it. Calvin's only chance of reaching Earth is getting into an escape pod that is perfectly armored for safe re-entry. If Miranda and David really want to sacrifice sacrifice themselves in the most gruesome way possible. Just letting the station burn up would probably solve all their problems. But really, they should leave Calvin trapped in the room they have him locked in and get into their escape pods and head back to Earth pronto, letting Earth's atmosphere accomplish what they couldn't. David enacts his plan, and Calvin follows, wrapping itself around the oxygen candles until they burn out. Eventually, Calvin follows him into the escape pod, lunging at him like his overly attached girlfriend. David coaxes it off his suit with his last oxygen candle and seals them inside. He alerts NASA about the disaster and casts off from the station in his pod. Miranda does the same in hers. David manually overrides his pod's controls and aims himself towards deep space. Suddenly, both pods hit a massive piece of flying debris from the station. Calvin wraps himself around David's arm on the joystick. As the pod sails into deep space, Calvin restrains David so he can't modify his trajectory. One of the pods breaches Atmo, crashing off the coast of Vietnam. Nearby fishermen rush to the scene. The story ends with the fishermen opening the lifeboat's hatch to discover David and Calvin inside. David is barely alive. Calvin has pierced his body like living shrapnel. Meanwhile, we learn Miranda's course was disrupted by the debris and she spirals away into deep space. As other boats arrive at the scene of David's crash to experience the invasion from Slither for themselves, we cut to black. Well, this is what happens when you send GQ models to deal with aliens instead of diehard nerds. David has literally served Earth up to Calvin on a silver platter. We can only imagine the sheer carnage and horror that ensues as Calvin grows, multiplies, and massacres all life on the planet. There were plenty of ways the astronauts aboard the ISS could have contained Calvin and jettisoned him off the station, and none of this would have been necessary if NASA had prepared the ISS by adding a new remote-controlled and totally isolated laboratory before Calvin's arrival. If they had left Calvin in hibernation and transferred him into a sealed container, or left Hugh to die in the lab and jettisoned that room into space, or used a trap to lure Calvin into a place where they could incinerate or jettison him, Calvin would never have reached our planet, dooming us all to a Capri Sun death where all the juices are sucked out of our bodies in seconds. In the end, I think Calvin from the movie Life was beaten. How would you have beaten Calvin? Let me know in the comments. Hit the like button to jettison Calvin and Hugh. Hit the subscribe button for more mishandlings of alien goo. Thanks for watching, and remember, in space, no one can hear you scream. And don't forget to cover your hideously barren walls with something dope from Displate by clicking my link in the description.